September 1944. A lone American bomber over Germany performs a maneuver no aircraft manual authorizes. Enemy fighters are closing fast from behind. Machine guns flashing. Tracers climbing through the sky like burning wires. The pilot suddenly pulls back the throttles and drops his landing flaps at nearly 200 miles per hour. Inside the bomber, the crew thinks he has lost his mind. The aircraft lurches violently. Metal groans through the wings. The bomber pivots harder than it was ever designed to turn, and the German fighter overshoots. It screams past the bomber's wing, too fast and too close to recover the attack. No one was supposed to survive that maneuver, but they do. And the pilot who discovered it, a quiet farm boy named Harold Sidel, will quietly change the survival odds of hundreds of airmen over Europe. By autumn 1944, the air war over Europe had become industrialized death. Every morning the bombers rose from England in endless silver formations stretching from horizon to horizon. Hundreds of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress crossing the channel toward Germany. Their targets were oil plants, rail yards, synthetic fuel factories, steel mills, the arteries feeding Hitler's war machine. And every morning German fighters climbed to meet them. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf FW-190s. Fast, aggressive, deadly. The sky above Europe had stopped resembling combat and started resembling mathematics written in smoke and aluminum. The B-17 Flying Fortress was built around one idea: endure. Heavy armor protected the crew compartments. Multiple machine guns covered nearly every angle. Entire formations flew so tightly together that defensive fire overlapped from aircraft to aircraft. The theory was simple. If enough bombers concentrated enough firepower into one place, enemy fighters would be unable to penetrate the formation safely. The bomber itself was not expected to evade. It was expected to survive. There is a difference. A fully loaded B-17 weighed nearly 30 tons and cruised at roughly 170 miles per hour. It was massive, slow, stable, a flying gun platform more than a true maneuvering aircraft. Pilots joke that flying a B-17 felt less like steering an airplane and more like negotiating with a building. Everything about its design favored predictability, which made it deadly to enemy bombers and vulnerable to enemy fighters. The doctrine drilled into every crew was brutally clear. Hold formation. Never separate. Trust your gunners. Trust the group. If a fighter attacked, the bomber maintained course while overlapping defensive fire from surrounding aircraft forced the attacker away. In theory, reality looked different over Germany. Over Schweinfurt, bombers fell burning through clouds of black flak. Over Brunswick, entire formations disintegrated under coordinated fighter attacks. Crews watched aircraft beside them explode in midair and kept flying because survival depended on maintaining formation discipline even while friends died within sight of the cockpit glass. The losses became statistical. Routine. A bomber crew's survival was measured mission by mission like gambling odds. And the odds were terrible. Harold Sidel hated the helplessness of it. Not fear. Helplessness. Those are different things. Fear sharpens people. Helplessness crushes them. Before the war, Sidel had grown up on a small Wisconsin farm where machinery mattered more than theory. When tractors failed during harvest season, nobody called specialists. You fixed them yourself because waiting meant losing crops and money you could not afford to lose. He learned early that machines often tolerated more than manuals claimed. Metal bent before breaking. Engines warned you before failing completely. And sometimes equipment described as impossible simply had not yet been pushed hard enough. He carried that mentality into aviation. Sidel was not flashy, not loud, not the kind of pilot people remembered entering a room. He watched more than he spoke, thought more than he bragged. Crewmen trusted him because he rarely sounded emotional, even during danger. But inside his head, he constantly analyzed systems. Aircraft vibrations, engine behavior, stress loads, control response. He flew bombers the way a mechanic studies machinery, with curiosity layered beneath discipline. His first combat mission changed him permanently. The flak was worse than training suggested possible. Black explosions appeared everywhere around the formation, hanging motionless for split seconds before shock waves slammed into the aircraft. Shrapnel punched through the fuselage like giant invisible claws. One fragment tore through the cockpit glass and buried itself inches from the co-pilot's chest. Then came the fighters. Tiny black dots above the formation becoming predators almost instantly. The waist gunners opened fire until spent shell casings piled around their boots. Tracer rounds crossed the sky in glowing orange streams, while German fighters rolled through the bomber formation and disappeared back into the sun before most crews fully processed what had happened. Sidel followed doctrine exactly. Straight. Level. Predictable. They survived. Barely. Back in England, he walked around his damaged bomber after landing while mechanics inspected the holes torn through the aircraft's skin. One engine smoked quietly in the cold air. Hydraulic fluid dripped onto the hardstand. Someone painted another mission marker beneath the cockpit. Another successful sortie. Another survival. But Sidel stared at the torn aluminum differently than the others. He was not thinking about luck. He was thinking about vulnerability. Because the B-17 could absorb punishment. But absorbing punishment was not the same thing as avoiding it. And that thought began to obsess him. The impossible problem facing every bomber pilot was brutally simple. How do you evade a fighter aircraft when your bomber cannot outrun it and cannot outturn it? The numbers answered immediately. You don't. A Focke-Wulf could exceed 400 miles per hour in a dive. A Messerschmitt climbed faster, rolled faster, accelerated faster, and turned tighter than anything remotely comparable to a heavy bomber. Even at emergency power settings, a B-17 remained slow and heavy. The official evasive maneuvers reflected this reality. Minor weaving patterns, small altitude changes, tiny heading adjustments. Enough to disturb enemy aim slightly, not enough to truly escape. And if a bomber broke formation completely, its survival odds collapsed almost instantly. German fighter pilots hunted isolated aircraft mercilessly. A lone bomber lost the overlapping machine gun protection of the formation. One damaged engine became catastrophic. One wounded pilot became fatal. The manuals repeated the warning constantly. Maintain formation integrity at all costs. Sidel understood the logic completely, but he also understood something else. Sometimes doctrine becomes trapped inside its own assumptions. The idea came to him during landing approaches. Every bomber pilot knew the feeling instinctively. When landing flaps extended, the aircraft's entire balance shifted. The nose pitched downward sharply. Control pressure changed. The aircraft suddenly responded differently to the controls. Most pilots considered it routine behavior. Sidel considered it leverage. Because the flaps did not merely create drag. They changed the center of lift. They altered how the aircraft rotated through the air. And that meant they temporarily gave the bomber maneuvering authority it normally lacked. Late at night inside his freezing Nissan hut, Sidel replayed the possibility over and over in his mind. What if the bomber used its flaps aggressively during combat, instead of only during landing? Not fully. Not long enough to stall. Just enough. A sudden flap deployment at high speed would decelerate the bomber violently, while tightening its turn radius far beyond what enemy fighters expected. The manuals explicitly forbade it. Deploy flaps above safe speed limits, and they could rip apart. Structural stress might damage the wings. Sudden drag could induce catastrophic stall conditions. Every engineer would reject the idea immediately, which was exactly why German fighter pilots would never expect it. Sidel kept the idea private initially. Because spoken aloud, it sounded insane. You're going to drop landing flaps during a fighter attack. You'll tear the wings off. You'll kill the whole crew. Maybe. But the idea refused to disappear. So he began experimenting quietly during return flights over England after missions ended. Small adjustments. One notch of flap. Then another. Watching carefully. Feeling how the aircraft reacted. The bomber pitched harder than expected. The controls loaded heavily. The wings flexed under stress. But the aircraft held together. And each experiment revealed the same truth. The B-17 was capable of more than doctrine admitted. Sidel kept testing, searching carefully for the edge. The exact point where physics still allowed survival even after the manuals declared survival impossible. At first, the changes were almost invisible. A little more flap. A little more back pressure. A slightly sharper turn on the long flight home over the English coast. Nothing dramatic enough for another pilot in formation to question openly. But Harold Sidel noticed every detail. The bomber reacted differently each time. Not gracefully. Never gracefully. A Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was still an enormous aircraft carrying fuel, bombs, ammunition, and 10 human lives. It was not suddenly agile. It did not become a fighter plane. But when the flaps extended partially at speeds higher than regulations allowed, something extraordinary happened. The aircraft pivoted harder, much harder. The sensation inside the cockpit was violent. The nose dropped sharply. The yoke became heavy in Sidel's hands. Vibrations surged through the controls as aerodynamic forces fought the bomber from every direction at once. The wings flexed visibly beneath stress. Sometimes the aircraft shuddered so hard that Sidel briefly believed the flaps might shear completely away from the wing. But they held. The structure complained. It survived. And each experiment pushed the boundary slightly further. His co-pilot eventually noticed. During one return flight over England, the bomber suddenly yawed harder than normal after Sidel manipulated the controls. "What are you doing?" the co-pilot asked. "Checking trim response," Sidel answered calmly. The explanation sounded technical enough to end the conversation. But Sidel knew exactly what he was really doing. He was searching for the edge, the exact point where official doctrine stopped and survival began. He found it in late September 1944 over the Ruhr Valley. The mission had already gone badly. Flak over the target was heavy but scattered, black bursts floating across the sky like suspended explosions frozen in place. Several bombers in the formation already trailed smoke, while others drifted out of position with damaged engines. The bomb run was complete. The formation had turned west toward home. That was when the fighters came. Two Focke-Wulf FW-190s dropped out of cloud cover at 4 o'clock high. The ball turret gunner spotted them first. Fighters. 4 o'clock. Tracer rounds followed immediately, streaking upward in glowing orange lines. From a distance they looked slow, almost floating. Up close they snapped past the aircraft with terrifying speed. One German pilot committed fully to the attack. Straight in. Aggressive. Confident. He expected the bomber to behave predictably because heavy bombers always behave predictably. That assumption kept fighter pilots alive. Sidel made his decision instantly. Throttle back. Flaps halfway. Pull hard. The bomber reacted like it had been struck by artillery. The nose dropped violently. The entire airframe bucked beneath him. Metal screamed through the wings as aerodynamic stress slammed into the aircraft all at once. His co-pilot shouted something. Sidel barely heard it. He hauled back on the yoke with both hands. The bomber pivoted. Not smoothly. Not elegantly. Violently. The entire aircraft carved sideways through the air harder than any German fighter pilot believed possible from a heavy bomber. The attacking fighter overshot immediately. Too much speed. Too little room to react. The German aircraft flashed past the bomber's left wing, so close Sidel saw the pilot's canopy clearly for a split second before the fighter disappeared ahead. The second fighter broke off its own attack immediately. Neither pilot attempted another pass. Sidel retracted the flaps carefully, added power, leveled the bomber before structural stress could build too far. Only then did he realize his hands were shaking. Inside the cockpit, his co-pilot stared at him speechless. Because both men understood the same thing. The bomber had just done something it was never supposed to do. And it had survived. Back in England, Sidel replayed the maneuver endlessly inside his head. Entry speed, flap angle, altitude loss, recovery timing. Every variable mattered. Because if the maneuver could be repeated consistently, then bomber crews suddenly possessed something they had lacked since the beginning of the air war. A way to force enemy fighters into mistakes. The idea spread quietly, not through official reports, through conversations, cigarettes after missions, coffee inside freezing debriefing huts while exhausted crews compared damage and survival stories. Sidel's crew mentioned what they had seen. Another crew listened. Then another. Some pilots dismissed it immediately. Combat distorted memory. Maybe the fighter had already disengaged. Maybe the overshoot happened naturally. But others listened carefully. One of them was Captain Ed Hartley. Hartley was older than most bomber pilots. 30 missions already completed. He had watched too many bombers burn because they simply could not maneuver once fighters committed properly. If Sidel's trick worked even occasionally, it mattered. Hartley found him in the mess hall one evening and demanded details. Step by step, Sidel explained everything. The logic, the risk, The tiny survivable window between stall and structural failure. Flaps increased lift and drag simultaneously. Drag bled speed violently, while altered lift characteristics tightened the bomber's turn radius for a few critical seconds. The attacking fighter, expecting the bomber to continue straight, suddenly found its closure rate completely wrong. The danger was obvious. Too much flap and the aircraft stalled. Too much speed and the structure risked damage. Too much back pressure and the wings overloaded. The maneuver only lasted seconds because seconds were all the bomber could tolerate. Hartley listened carefully, then nodded once. "I'll try it if I get the chance." 2 days later, he did. Their formation was attacked near Capsule by 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s. One locked directly onto Hartley's bomber from 6 o'clock low and kept closing despite heavy defensive fire from the waist gunners. Hartley remembered Sidel's instructions. Throttle back. Partial flaps. Pull hard. The bomber shuddered violently. The altimeter unwound frighteningly fast. But the nose came around. The German fighter overshot completely, flashing past the bomber close enough that Hartley could see the spinning blur of the propeller hub through the cockpit glass. The fighter never returned. That night Hartley found Sidel again. "It worked," he said quietly. "You just saved 10 men. After that, the maneuver stopped being rumor. It became a tactic. Crews started practicing cautiously during non-combat portions of flights over England. Pilots compared results, memorized safe speed windows, estimated altitude losses, and tested recovery timing. Some crews called it the Sidel break. Others called it the flap trick. The name didn't matter. The survival did. Not every pilot could execute it properly. Timing was everything. Deploy the flaps too early and the fighter adjusted easily. Too late and the attack already landed. Too aggressively and the bomber risked entering a catastrophic stall. Several crews nearly lost control during early experiments. One B-17 entered a partial spin before recovering barely above the English countryside. Another returned with warped flap assemblies and stress fractures near the wing roots. The maneuver was dangerous. Everyone understood that clearly. But dying predictably was dangerous too. And bomber crews increasingly preferred dangerous options over helplessness. Mission reports slowly began reflecting the change. Enemy fighter overshot during evasive maneuver. Rapid deceleration disrupted attack run. Aggressive flap-assisted turned successful. Eventually enough reports reached headquarters that senior officers started asking questions. What exactly were bomber crews doing? Who authorized this? Was it officially sanctioned? The answer made the command structure uncomfortable. No one had authorized it. The maneuver had emerged naturally from combat survival itself. And once crews believed it worked, suppressing it became almost impossible. A flight engineer was eventually assigned to evaluate the tactics scientifically. He watched demonstration flights personally, observed the flap deployment, watched the bomber wrench itself through impossible turns. Then he returned and calculated the stress loads, wing tolerances, flap hinge limits, structural margins. His conclusion surprised almost everyone. The maneuver violated operational limits, but only barely. If executed correctly, the B-17 could survive the stress for short periods. Not repeatedly, not carelessly, but long enough to matter. By December 1944, the maneuver quietly entered revised operational guidance buried deep inside emergency evasive procedures for heavy bombers. Not openly encouraged, not openly forbidden, acknowledged. And once something enters a military manual, it stops being madness. It becomes doctrine. By early 1945, the maneuver had spread farther than Harold Sidel ever intended. Bomber crews across the 8th Air Force were talking about it now. Not loudly, not officially, but the knowledge moved through the bomber groups the way survival knowledge always moves in war, through exhausted conversations after missions, through cigarette smoke in briefing huts, through pilots comparing damage reports beside oil-stained aircraft on freezing English airfields. The Germans noticed the difference before headquarters fully understood it. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting that some American bombers were behaving unpredictably during attack runs. Heavy bombers were supposed to stay steady. That was the entire foundation of German interception tactics. Fighter pilots calculated closure rates and firing angles assuming the bomber would continue straight ahead while defensive gunners sprayed tracers desperately behind it. The Sidel maneuver shattered those assumptions. A sudden flap deployment changed the geometry instantly. The bomber decelerated violently and pivoted harder than expected. By the time a German pilot corrected his attack angle, the window was often gone, sometimes by inches, sometimes entirely. And in aerial combat, inches decide who burns and who lands. Precise numbers remain difficult to isolate because the air war over Europe existed inside chaos. Weather changed survival odds. Cloud cover changed survival odds. Flak density changed survival odds. Pilot fatigue changed survival odds. Luck changed everything. But squadron commanders noticed patterns impossible to ignore. Aircraft that statistically should have been destroyed were returning damaged but intact. Crews described fighters overshooting attack runs or abandoning firing passes after bombers performed sudden aggressive turns. The 390th Bomb Group tracked the reports internally over several months. Their conclusion was blunt. Bombers employing the maneuver during isolated fighter engagements showed roughly 15% higher return rates. 15%. At first glance, it sounded small. But multiplied across hundreds of sorties and thousands of airmen, 15% became enormous. It represented entire crews surviving who likely would have died months earlier. Fathers, brothers, pilots, gunners, navigators, men who returned home because one bomber pilot decided to question the limits written in a manual. The Luftwaffe adapted eventually. They had to. German fighter pilots shifted increasingly toward head-on attacks, where the flap maneuver proved less effective. Others attacked from steep vertical angles above or below the bomber formation to reduce the chance of overshoot. But adaptation takes time, and time in war is measured in lives. During those critical months, bomber crews continued surviving attacks that previously would have ended in fire spiraling toward the ground. By spring 1945, the war itself was changing. The Luftwaffe that once terrorized Allied bombers over Germany was collapsing. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Experienced fighter pilots were dead or irreplaceable. Entire factories producing fighters and engines lay shattered beneath continuous bombing campaigns. The skies increasingly belonged to the Allies. The Sidel maneuver was no longer as desperately necessary as before. But by then, it had already accomplished something larger than survival statistics. It had proven a truth most military institutions struggle to accept. Innovation does not always come from command headquarters. Sometimes it comes from the men trapped closest to the problem. Harold Sidel was not an engineer in a laboratory. He was not a senior strategist standing over maps. He was a bomber pilot sitting inside a vibrating aluminum aircraft while enemy fighters closed through clouds of tracer fire. He understood the B-17 physically, the way its controls loaded under stress, the way the wings flexed during hard turns, the point where the aircraft stopped following doctrine and started following instinct. And because he understood the bomber as a living machine instead of an abstract blueprint, he saw possibilities hidden from everyone else. The maneuver eventually entered official operational guidance quietly, not celebrated, not advertised. Buried deep inside revised emergency evasive procedures for heavy bombers. Restricted, conditional, approved only within narrow speed and altitude windows. But present, and once an idea enters a military manual, it stops belonging to rumor. It becomes history. Harold Sidel himself seemed almost uninterested in that history afterward. When the war ended in 1945, he returned home to Wisconsin without ceremony. Like many veterans, he stepped out of one world and back into another almost overnight. 1 month, he was flying through exploding skies over Germany. The next, he was back beneath open Midwestern fields repairing machinery on the same farmland where he had grown up. Neighbors knew he had served. Family knew he had flown bombers. But he rarely spoke about combat. The word hero embarrassed him, because the maneuver had never felt heroic to him. It felt logical, a problem observed, a system analyzed, a risk calculated, a solution tested. That was all. He returned to the habits he understood best: fixing tractors, repairing engines, working quietly with his hands. The war had not fundamentally changed him. If anything, it revealed who he already was long before Europe. A man who looked at machines differently than other people did. Decades later, aviation historians researching tactical innovations of World War II rediscovered references to the maneuver hidden inside after-action reports and training updates. They traced the tactic backward through squadron records until Harold Sidel's name appeared repeatedly near the earliest documented uses. When interviewers eventually asked him about it, his response remained characteristically modest. He shrugged, said other pilots figured it out too, said he was probably the first idiot willing to try it. But the historical record suggested otherwise. The maneuver carried his fingerprints everywhere. The timing, the aerodynamic logic, the understanding of structural limits under combat stress. It reflected the instincts of someone who spent his life studying how machinery behaved beyond intended limits. Harold Sidel died in 1998 at 79 years old. No major headlines followed. No national ceremonies. Just the quiet passing of a man who once looked at an impossible situation over Germany and refused to believe the rules were final. Today, many of the wartime bomber airfields in England are silent. The Nissan huts are mostly gone. The hardstands crack beneath weeds and rain. Museums preserve fragments of aluminum skin, faded photographs, and mission logs written by young men who often expected not to survive long enough to read them again. Somewhere inside those records are small references to aggressive flap-assisted evasive maneuvers. Tiny technical notes hidden among casualty reports and fuel calculations. Easy details to overlook. But history often changes through details exactly like that. Not always through massive inventions. Sometimes through one exhausted pilot deciding to question a rule everyone else accepted. Because that was the real lesson of Harold Sidel's maneuver. The manuals were not sacred. The aircraft was capable of more than doctrine believed. And survival sometimes belongs to the people willing to test the boundary between impossible and merely dangerous. Inside the chaos of a bomber under attack, with enemy fighters closing fast and seconds separating life from death, Harold Sidel saw something no one else had imagined. Not glory, not heroism, possibility. And then he reached for the flap lever.